Hello and welcome to my Constitution Day podcast. This is Derek Maxfield. A special hello to all my friends in Connecticut. So I'm going to entitle this Finding a New Way in honor of Constitution Day. I want to talk about the creation of the Constitution that we live under now and how we got there. To start with, most people don't understand that the Constitution is actually our second American Constitution. The first was called the Articles of Confederation and was in place less than a decade before they were abandoned in favor of the model we have now. That's why I call this Finding a New Way. What we had to start with didn't exactly suit our needs, and we needed to find a new direction. What I mean by that is the Articles of Confederation were a very problematic document. First of all, it created this compact or confederation of 13 equal and sovereign states. Those words are key, equal and sovereign. What that meant was no one of them could tell any of the rest of them what to do, and nor could a national government really impose its will on any one of them, since they were sovereign. The Articles of Confederation were really designed to leave most power in the hands of the states themselves and create this kind of skeletal national government with very little power indeed. The Articles of Confederation were created just after the Declaration of Independence and passed by the Second Continental Congress in 1777. But the problem here is it took until 1781 for the Articles of Confederation to be ratified. The stipulation in the Articles were that all 13 states would have to agree in order for a new government to be founded. And so it took until 1781 until all 13 states signed off on this. The problem, of course, is that we were fighting a war at the time. The Revolutionary War was going on, and we had essentially no national government. The Second Continental Congress acted as the American government de facto, but in fact had no authority as a government and had to rely simply upon the cooperation of the states, which many times was not forthcoming, much to the regret of George Washington and others. So we fought the American Revolution without a national government. And that meant that there were certain limitations on what could get done and the coordination possible during the war. In many ways, it's a miracle that we came through it. Now, the Articles of Confederation, besides creating this compact of 13 states, created a single Congress. That was the national government it created, a single House of Congress with equal representation. There was no president, there was no national judiciary, just this one House of Congress, and at that time the nation's capital was in New York City, and so that is where that Congress sat. But what this meant was that there's no leadership, really. You have a committee that is the national government, and that's it. Now, besides that, it was a Congress that had very limited powers. As I said, they wanted to leave most powers in the hands of the states, and they truly did that. So the National Congress could establish post office, manage Indian affairs, declare war, things that the states themselves really couldn't do, but it had some severe limitations. For example, it could not lay and collect taxes of any kind, which meant that this national government had no revenue. It had no revenue. It had no money to pay the bills, and that was a huge problem after the Revolutionary War ended. As I said, leadership was a problem. There was no, essentially, leadership. There was no one person to look to. And another major drawback was that the National Congress did not have the power to raise troops. So it could not create a federal fighting force. It could call on the states to send militia, but itself could not call up troops. And this was really quite a problem. So we came to 1781, and finally the Articles of Confederation are ratified, but that's the same year that the fighting part of the Revolutionary War ended. with the surrender of Yorktown, Virginia. Finally, peace comes in 1783 with the Treaty of Peace with Great Britain, in which Great Britain recognizes our independence. So, at the same moment that we're getting a national government, finally, the war is ending. And but that doesn't mean the end of our troubles. Money troubles were a huge problem. For example, we had borrowed money from France. We had borrowed money from the Netherlands. We had even borrowed money from the American people. And all of these were going to want their money back at some point. So we had this mountain of bills and no way to pay the bills because our national government had no ability to raise and lay taxes or create a revenue stream for itself. They could ask the states for money, but in the wake of the revolution, that was hard to come by. And so we drifted through the 1780s with this very weak national government with very little power and a whole lot of stalemate. One of the interesting features of the Confederation Congress is that most major bills required unanimous consent in order to pass them. And then there were a number of attempts during that period to amend the Articles of Confederation to give Congress the power to lay and collect taxes to pay the bills. Those were defeated each time because that also required unanimous consent. So you're stuck with this weak government with very limited power. As time goes on, the problems become more and more compounded, and in the middle of the 1780s, there is a rebellion in western Massachusetts that kind of brings this into focus. Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion largely created by a group of Revolutionary War veterans that had come home only to find the courts trying to foreclose on their properties because they couldn't pay their property taxes. And of course, many Revolutionary War veterans had never been paid for their service during the Revolution, and this is what's led them into these straits. Their answer was to try to shut down the court system to prevent foreclosures. Well, Massachusetts, in trying to put down this rebellion, called on help to the National Congress in New York City, and of course the Confederation Congress had to say, sorry, we can't help with that, you're on your own. And this led to some interesting conversations in this Congress because, they were frustrated that they couldn't help Massachusetts, but it also came to mind to them that what would happen in the American South if there was a great slave rebellion and slaves were rioting and murdering their masters in their beds, which is, of course, something that they all worried about. So this conversation really got people worried about the mistake they had made by making such a weak national government. It was an interesting little man by the name of James Madison that began the movement toward a new constitution. Madison was a fairly young man, a recent graduate of the College of New Jersey, what we would now call Princeton University, and he was kind of a younger member of the Founding Fathers. He had not been there for things like the Declaration of Independence, but he comes along now at this important moment as a member of the National Congress. He also was a participant in a trade conference between Virginia and Maryland, tried to solve some trade disputes, and they just kept coming back to these same conclusions, which really were, it's too bad we didn't have a national government that could act as an arbiter in these problems. So Madison came up with the idea of calling a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you were to see me, you'd see that I was using air quotes, revise the Articles of Confederation, because that's not really what Madison had in mind at all. He paid a call on George Washington, who was then in retirement. Now, Washington, during the Revolution, had been kind of the only leader America had, somebody that America could look to, but he had been in retirement all this time, and really out of the public eye. But Madison knew that if there was to be a constitutional convention, that George Washington would be the indispensable man. The states would take this much more seriously if they knew that George Washington was involved. And so Madison had to convince Washington to be present at this convention scheduled for May 1787 in Philadelphia, and let him in on what he thought needed to be done. Now, Washington himself was reluctant. He had earned his stripes. He had a reputation. The early histories of the Revolutionary War were being written, and he had a huge hero's role in all of that, and he had a reputation to protect. And he was very, very cognizant of his place in history. On the other hand, he could see that the Articles of Confederation were a failure, and Madison was able to convince him ultimately to participate. So the convention was called for Philadelphia, as I said, in 1787, and most of the states did send delegates. After all, it was an opportunity to be in the same room with George Washington, who by then was a walking legend, and so many of them were attracted by this. And Washington, of course, was immediately chosen as the presiding officer of this convention. As presiding officer, he immediately imposed a code of silence. He told the men in that room that nobody was to talk about what was done in that room until they had completed their work. Now, the reason for this is that Washington and Madison knew that what they had in mind was not really to revise the Articles of Confederation, which of course would require unanimous consent in any case. No, they had it in mind to write an entirely new constitution. And this was borne out almost immediately when the convention got started, when James Madison laid on the table his formulation for a new constitution. And this did shock some in the room, and the smaller states like New Jersey and Delaware thought that this formulation favored the large states in particular, this Virginia plan as it came to be known, and nearly walked out. Madison, trying to keep the convention together, said, well, if you don't like my plan, let's see your plan. And a few days later, this led to a new version called the New Jersey Plan. Very different plans these were. The Virginia Plan would create a president chosen by Congress. It featured a two-house Congress. It featured a national judiciary. Clearly, this did favor the large states. The New Jersey Plan came back very different. What they wanted to do was hold on to the Articles of Confederation, but give the Congress a limited power to tax. After all, because they could see that this was a major problem. And so it took all summer for these men to come to a compromise, what is called the Great Compromise, or in Connecticut, it's called the Connecticut Compromise, as some folks out there listening might already know. And that's largely because Connecticut played a large role in helping to formulate the Great Compromise. Now, what they came to ultimately was a document that did, in fact, create three branches of government. You had the legislature, a two-house Congress, a Senate, and a House of Representatives. It created an executive with a president and a national judiciary, which would ultimately create the federal court system. So three branches of government, though it's really a myth in American history that they wanted to create three equal branches of government. Not at all. They always envisioned that it would be the legislature that would be the senior partner in our arrangement of government. And even George Washington understood this quite well, though, he will be the first president of the United States. So this Great Compromise really required a lot of give on all sides, but there was a great agreement that something really had to be done here, or the whole American experiment was going to fail. And so they were highly motivated. And what really strikes me is interesting is here's these men stuck in this brick building in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. No air conditioning. All the windows are closed and locked. The doors are closed and locked and guarded. And yet, this room must have been like an oven, right? And these gentlemen wearing these great coats and powdered wigs, the room must have smelled really nice at the end of the day, huh? But yet they came to this compromise, and this is what brings us the Constitution that we now live under. And it was surprisingly quickly ratified. Within just a couple of years, it's ratified, and we hold our first federal elections. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great Constitution Day.